Hi, this is David Bernstein, President and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. We're glad that you joined us for this very special briefing webinar on the role of anti-Semitism and white nationalism. We're all heartbroken about what happened in Pittsburgh. Many of us had very close ties to the Pittsburgh Jewish community. Some know people and families that are affected. These are very, very trying times. This is one of the worst, if not the worst, anti-Semitic attack in American history, and we're all just reeling from it. And we express our heartfelt condolences and our support for the families affected. We know that there are vigils going around the country, and we're glad you're all participating and playing an active role in that. We know that there are also briefings on security and practical measures that JCRCs and the Community Relations Network can take and help us mitigate the risks that are out there. But today we want to do something a bit different. We have a very close relationship with Eric Ward, who's the executive director of the Western States Center. He's a real thought leader and a community organizer around issues of hate violence and civil rights issues. He's really one of the most thoughtful people on these issues, and he wrote the definitive article on how anti-Semitism animates white nationalism. So we're really glad, Eric, that you're with us today to give us a briefing and to also explore with us some ways that we might combat this phenomenon, because we're all thinking about ways we can make a difference here. You are welcome to type questions into the question bar, and we'll see those questions and try to get to as many of them as we can. But Eric, thank you so much for being with us.
David, thank you so much for having me today, and thanks to JCPA for pulling together this briefing. I know it is early or late, depending where folks are listening from. But I really appreciate being able to spend time with you. My thoughts go out to everyone in Pittsburgh and the Tree of Life Synagogue, particularly the family and friends of the 11 individuals who were killed and the other 6 who were injured, including 4 police officers. I really want to highlight the heroism of law enforcement there who were outgunned and yet still continue to put their lives out there to save as many people as possible. I'm just very happy to be with you today, even under this very sad moment as we mourn, to find ways that we can continue to move together as a nation.
So we appreciate that, Eric. So Eric, I know that you've done some very unique research on white nationalism and the role of anti-Semitism. And would you tell us how you came by that? How you learned about the role of anti-Semitism and white nationalism?
Certainly. 30 years ago, next week, in Portland, Oregon, a young Ethiopian immigrant by the name of Mulugeta Sarah was coming home from community college with his friends. They were saying goodnight to one another. Another car and individuals began honking at them, yelling things, being very aggressive. And it turned out to be a group of neo-Nazi skinheads. These neo-Nazis then continued with their aggression, eventually leading to a physical attack and the beating death of Mulugeta Sarah by these neo-Nazis with baseball bats. It was, at the time, one of the most brutal and shocking hate crimes to take place in the country. As a young organizer and civil rights organizer, we began to try to understand how we could respond to hate crimes. And what we were beginning to understand was a rise of a movement that is now known as white nationalism. It was as we were learning and trying to understand this movement that we began to notice something very distinct. And what we began to notice is that even the anti-immigrant and the anti-refugee rhetoric being used by this neo-Nazi group and those who supported them, like White Aryan Resistance, the Aryan Nations, the National Alliance, to name a few, certainly were attacking immigrants. We're certainly attacking Latinos, African Americans, gays and lesbians, people they perceive to be feminists. But always at the center of their argument was this idea that it was driven by a global conspiracy. In the 90s, I attended a more public-facing event in Seattle, Washington, that included a number of individuals associated with the white nationalist movement. And it was in that meeting that it became very clear. What happened is that an individual approached me to actually welcome me as an African American to this far right leaning event. And what he said to me was that, you know, I'm glad that you were here, because this weekend speakers are saying we need to reach out to Blacks, we need to reach out to Asians and Latinos, because we need to build a coalition against our real enemy. I don't have to tell folks on this call who this person meant when he said real enemy. As another white nationalist, Louis Beam, who was a longtime strategist of the white nationalist movement in the 80s and 90s, said, first we deal with the federal government, then we deal with the question of the Jews. What was apparent to me and very clear was that there was a global conspiracy within the white nationalist movement that led it to believe that it was in an ultimate war with Jews. And that led me to try to then understand what was anti-Semitism and how did it drive this movement that was so bent on violent revolution in the United States.
Right. So, so what are the ideological roots, and why is it that they're so obsessed with us? Why Jews and not some other group?
Certainly. So to understand that, I think we have to look at two things very, very quickly. One is a document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a forgery that was created in Tsarist Russia that purported to tell the story of a secret meeting of Jewish elders who were planning and plotting the takeover of the world and the enslavement of humanity as it was framed. While this book is unknown to actually many people, to the majority of people on the planet and in the United States, what those of us know who work within civil and human rights is that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion has had an incredible cultural effect on the way that people understand conspiracy, right? And it has been used very subtly to attack Jews, right, to justify anti-Semitism and other discrimination against the Jewish community throughout history since it's been created. But it's also a mainstream cultural phenomenon. What we've also seen is that the concepts put forth in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion have been mainstreamed. And sometimes we see a softening of those conspiracies, and perhaps the word Jew is never mentioned or Zionist is never mentioned, but the structure of the conspiracy is this, that there is a secret group, a cabal, that has come together to take away the rights, to depossess people of their lives, and that it's done in secret, and that it's of almost supernatural proportions. I often tell people that if you want to understand kind of the modern mainstreaming of the concepts of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the famous TV series from the late 90s called The X-Files is a perfect example of this. In the TV series, The X-Files, it is framed around the idea of a global conspiracy with an alien force, something that is not human, but can pass as human, that has been secretly manipulating world events. That, in a nutshell, is how anti-Semitism at this level plays out daily, and it is how the white nationalist movement has also adopted its own anti-Semitic conspiracy. Why the Jews?
What do they actually think that Jews are trying to hatch? What is the outcome that they're so upset about, that we've allegedly created?
So the conspiracy is simply that it is an ultimate evil trying to take over the world. And white nationalists have adopted it in this way. There has been a concerted backlash in this country since the victory of the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s. Now, you have to imagine the civil rights movement was a significant victory in the United States. It was the deconstruction of de jure white supremacy, the idea that white superiority was the rule of law in America. That is how this country existed pre-1967. It is in the wake of the victory of the civil rights movement that the white nationalist movement begins to adopt this more hardcore central view of anti-Semitism. What occurs is this. It's actually quite simple. If you are an arch segregationist, you believe in Jim Crow, you believe in separate and equal, you believe that Black people are inferior, you don't question it. It is like breathing air. It is just how you were socialized. Now, imagine you now suffer one of the largest historical political defeats to folks you saw as inferior. How do you explain that loss? Do you then admit that you lost against folks you thought were inferior and that your worldview was wrong? Or do you begin to try to look for another answer? And for many segregationists, they began to look for another answer. And for them, ultimately, they were looking to the experiences many veterans had seen in Europe, right? How anti-Semitism had played out there and between the 20s and the 40s. And you began to see an argument put forth by some of the more radical segregationists. And it was this, that they couldn't have lost against an inferior people. There had to be a secret conspiracy at work, and that secret conspiracy was formulated and ran by Jews. That allowed them then to continue to place people of color as inferior in society. It allowed them to hold on to the idea of white superiority and to find a new scapegoat to then blame for any changes in America that they didn't agree with, whether it was immigrant rights, whether it was the expansion of worker equality, access to schools, the end of segregation, the list goes on. All of these began to be centered as a worldwide Jewish conspiracy to dispossess white racists of their homeland. Ultimately, the most radical elements of the white nationalist movement came to believe that the United States wasn't theirs, one of the most popular terms in the 80s and 90s was a term called ZOG, or Zionist Occupational Government. It drove some of the terrorism that occurred by white nationalists in the 80s and 90s. And David, the purpose of it was to justify a political loss and to set the stage for a future political revolution in the U.S.
So how has white nationalism changed in the past few years? Has it morphed into something different? Is it the same as what you originally observed in the 1990s when you began this quest?
So white nationalism in the 80s and 90s was primarily a fringe phenomenon. These were loose neo-Nazi organizations, paramilitary organizations, but fairly small and relegated to the margins of society. What I would say now is that much of the ideas of white nationalism have become more mainstreamed in America, but more frightening than becoming mainstreamed is that we now live in a time where we are generationally far enough away from the horrors of the Holocaust that created an effective moral barrier against hatred like anti-Semitism, that we now find politicians and others utilizing anti-Semitic tropes has a form of political attack. And whether it is conscious or unconscious, the use of those anti-Semitic tropes create an environment that is unsafe both for the Jewish community and for non-Jews as well. The idea of the terms of a globalist conspiracy, a media conspiracy, a Hollywood conspiracy, these are anti-Semitic tropes that were used in the 1920s and 30s to justify the discrimination against the Jewish community. In Europe, it ultimately led to the Holocaust. In the United States, this was eventually resoundingly condemned and put back to the margins of society. Today, that genie is now out of the bottle, and the creation of that environment, whether it is anti-Semitic tropes used in critique of Israeli politics, whether it is anti-Semitic tropes used to critique migrant and refugee issues, it has signaled to these extremists on the margins that they now have full permission to act out on their violence and intimidation. And that is what directly led to the events of yesterday.
Okay, thank you. So to what degree do you believe that political leadership in our current political culture created the mood that might lead to this? And what degree do you view this as an individual act, or how do you assess why this happened now?
So it happened now. I believe that over the last few months, many of us have been warning about this increasing rise of anti-Semitic attitudes within the general culture. We have pleaded and begged and asked progressive and social justice, human rights, civil rights organizations, people of goodwill, to begin to identify this trend and to speak out against it, because it signaled the potential for violence in America. But to be more specific, I believe that the events of yesterday, this mass shooting, this mass killing, has its roots in two recent events. And the killer, the person who has been arrested for these shootings, certainly has expressed this on social media, but it appears to be this, that the ongoing attacks on George Soros, who is a liberal philanthropist, have utilized very anti-Semitic tropes. The term of the use conspiracy, the way that he has been framed has, a mastermind of the progressive movement, as if someone could have actual influence over the progressive movement or make it do anything in lockstep. But these ideas that somehow George Soros is this puppet master, pulling the strings of social justice in America and globally, has certainly opened up the space for this. I believe that the refugee caravan that is in Mexico and the utilization of that issue as a political attack to raise excitement for the election, and then tying that to George Soros also added extra fuel. And what we know from this killer is that it was his belief that Hayes was part of this larger conspiracy that led him to believe that he needed to walk into this church. At the end of the day, we don't know whether it was a coordinated attack or an individual act. We will have to allow law enforcement to do its job. But I will say this: if it were a coordinated attack by an organization, that certainly would be concerning. I'm actually more concerned if it was an individual, right attack, just a lone wolf, as people call them, because we have seen a number of these incidences happening around the country. This is certainly the deadliest. And it certainly was intentionally focused on the Jewish community. But we also have to point out that a few days earlier, 2 African Americans were shot at a Kroger supermarket by a white individual who first tried to enter a black church, couldn't get into the church, and then walked over to the supermarket and killed 2 African Americans, and has been clear, right, that at least in his language to one of the witnesses, that it was racially motivated. What we're seeing, David, is a climate that is signaling to individuals that they have permission to act on their biases. And we have elected officials, right? Not just on the right, because we can point back to over the last 10 years and lots of irresponsible rhetoric. But what we see are elected officials who are using anti-Semitic tropes, and those anti-Semitic tropes are mainstreaming anti-Semitism in such a way that they have become virtual calls for violence. And I think ultimately, whether they are Democrat or Republican, this is not a partisan issue, right? That we have to begin to hold elected officials accountable for the use of those tropes. It does not matter who the target is. It is about the tropes that are being utilized.
Right. So thank you for that. So we've also heard a lot about the role of social media, and that such attacks would not be possible without a social media platform. We've also learned about newer or underground social media like Gab that apparently he was using to express his views. Can you tell us a little bit about this and what role social media plays in white nationalism?
Certainly, and I would refer folks to the work of the Anti-Defamation League, Southern Poverty Law Center, and early work by the American Jewish Committee, who really did groundbreaking work on the relationship between social media and white nationalists. Let's be clear, social media has allowed many of us to have broad-based conversations with a much broader audience. That is the same for white nationalists as well. Social media has also removed many of the traditional filters for how information gets transmitted in the country. And it has, in many ways, placed each of us as citizen journalists and pundits. The problem with that is that journalists are actually trained in their trade. They are trained to look for facts, right, to ensure that there is a process of ascertaining whether something is valid or not, and even parameters on how one shares opinion. That is not the case for the most part on social media. Initially, I would say in the mid-90s, probably until about 2010, white nationalists used the internet primarily to communicate with one another, right, and to find one another and to share information. It actually wasn't that significant of a recruitment tool. This begins to change in 2010, with the advent of Twitter and Facebook. And what you begin to see is that white nationalists begin to explore how social media can be not only a place to network, but a propaganda and recruiting tool. This goes on, I think, to advance really quickly to Charlottesville. And it is in the midst of the frightening march in Charlottesville, where white nationalists are chanting, "Jews will not replace us," that many organizations in dialogue with Facebook and PayPal and Twitter begin to put pressure to really either mediate white nationalists who are abusing social media or to remove them altogether. It is one of the unintended outcomes of that removal that Gab appears. And Gab is an ad-free social network. It is self-described as being developed by creators who believe in free speech, individual liberty, and the free flow of information online. And it says all are welcome, but primarily Gab has become the refuge of the white nationalist movement and alt-right who have no longer find themselves at home on Facebook or Twitter. It is unlikely to be on the radar of most Americans or, quite frankly, civil or human rights groups. And so for the first time, we are not actually seeing, all of the conversations that are occurring, trends that might be developing in ways that we might. In addition, white nationalists have, as they've been removed from PayPal, have worked to create new structures to move money and move currency as well. So the role of social media is primarily one of propaganda, right, to help shift the national narrative and national conversation, and now to recruit new members, including, if you were to look at Gab, you would find channels on Gab where white nationalists actually trade notes on how to recruit people through online gaming forums and popular games that young people play and young adults play online.
Right. So I'm going to take a couple questions from our field, and then we'll go into some practical steps. To what degree is this a religious motivation? You spoke a lot about how it's animated by popular conspiracy theories. Is there a religious motivation that might be at work as well?
So there's certainly, I mean, in what I would say is, as I grew up Southern Baptist, right? And so, what we know, at least in the more broader, broader environment, that certainly we as Christians have to do a much better job at not promoting anti-Semitism consciously or unconsciously. Look, like all forms of bigotry, they exist both at the conscious bias level, individuals who openly embrace anti-Semitism or the hatred of Jews. But anti-Semitism can also be a more subtle, unconscious form of bias that gets reinforced by community institutions. And, part of our work is to ensure that that unconscious bias isn't occurring. That is the same for racism and other forms of bigotry as well. So there are certainly religious elements who promote anti-Semitism, right? Through the idea of tropes such as, Christ killers or blood sacrifice, blood libel, and these tropes certainly do reinforce a larger anti-Semitic environment. I think it is really important for Christian leaders, but quite frankly, leaders of any faith, to really speak up publicly in this moment. What we say or we don't say is a signal to others out there about how important we think this moment is and how alarming it is.
So you spoke of how politicians have helped enable this phenomenon. Can you cite an example or two that tropes that politicians might have used that might have made this more likely?
Yeah, I can actually give you a good example. The same day that I believe it's the same day that the individual who had been mailing explosives around the country was finally apprehended. Donald Trump was speaking, and he was speaking about the migrant and refugee caravan that is moving through Mexico. And at one point, he starts talking about globalists. And we all have to admit, right, now that we are at a point when individuals are talking about globalists, that it has become an anti-Semitic dog whistle. By comparison, when I hear people use the word thug, I am 99% of the time, right, it is a dog whistle, and what folks are really talking about are African Americans for the most part, and we know this, and we have to call it out. So Donald Trump is giving a speech talking about migrants, and then he uses the word globalist. You can watch this speech on C-SPAN 3. As he says globalist, the crowd, his audience, starts chanting Soros, Soros, Soros. And his response is not to condemn that, not to be a John McCain and say, you are now leading into dangerous anti-Semitism. No, what he says is lock him up. And he says this about a man who had just a few days earlier received an explosive in his mailbox. And it is that type of irresponsible rhetoric that sets a larger stage for the violence that we saw yesterday. It signals to extremists who believe that the only way they win back America is through the killing of Jews, that their time has arrived. And it's up to us and it's up to elected officials to close down that political space. We have to draw a clear moral line against bigotry. And the way that we do that is by elected officials speaking up and unequivocally denouncing anti-Semitism, right? And if they don't, it is our job to hold them accountable. Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, whoever. And we have to get to a point where we are not manipulated by the partisan argument. The targeting of any Jewish leader in this country by the left or the right that utilizes anti-Semitic tropes should no longer be tolerated, and it is not acceptable.
Right. So one last question before we get into practical steps. I think it's an important one that we haven't fully explored. How do these white nationalist right-wing views influence anti-Semitism on the left? Is there a relationship between the two?
So what I will say is that if we start with an assumption, there is no left or right-wing anti-Semitism. What we have is anti-Semitism in America. And anti-Semitism has been part and parcel of America for a very long time, including preceding the white nationalist movement. What has happened now is that anti-Semitism is being organized. It's being weaponized. And it is being weaponized primarily by folks on the white nationalist and extreme right, right? But you also I can point to many examples of it being weaponized on the left as well. What people are doing is they are drawing off of things that already exist. So what I try to remind people is that, you know, anti-Semites don't bring anti-Semitism into our communities. They simply organize the anti-Semitism that already exists. I have been in this world. I am cynical enough around politics that I know one truth, that if politicians didn't believe that anti-Semitism was an effective organizing strategy, they wouldn't use it. They use it because they actually know it resonates with a certain portion of the American population. And so at the end of the day, right, the overlap, right, isn't the politics of the left or right. And I'm not drawing an equivalency between anti-Semitism on the left or right, right? We haven't had left organizations who have been murdering Jews in America. So you know, I want to be clear. But what we have to understand is, regardless of where it comes from, regardless at what level it is utilized, whether we're talking about physical threats, right, or just anti-Semitic tropes, we are at a place now where American democracy, right, cannot exist with anti-Semitism in play. Anti-Semitism doesn't only put the Jewish community at risk, it puts all of us at risk. Anti-Semitism is not a left or right issue. It is a moral issue, and it is one that must be challenged because it puts lives at risk, but it also puts our democracy at risk.
Okay, so Eric, what do you think our strategy ought to be? Maybe first at the sort of higher conceptual level, and I think you might have just touched on in that question about trying to make sure we use elected officials and others to call out anti-Semitism where we see it. But do you have any other thoughts at sort of the highest level of strategy of how we need to tackle this?
Yeah, so at the highest level, I think we need to begin to think about three things. The first is, what does it look like to really pressure elected officials to speak out across the political spectrum, right? And there almost needs to be a full accounting of elected officials across the country, from federal to the most local. I think it is really an imperative right now. We need their leadership and we need their voice, and we need to hear them say that anti-Semitism is unacceptable in America today. So I think that is critically important. Two, look, I am a liberal, right? But regardless of whether one is liberal or conservative, I think it is time for us within our own spaces to begin to challenge other leaders and organizations. So if you're conservative, it needs to be done within your circles. If you're liberal, within your circles. It's not about attacking the other side. It is about working with your organizations and leaders to have them both understand how anti-Semitism plays out, right? How anti-Semitic tropes have been used throughout history, right? And to try to push these organizations to begin to publicly take steps that show that they won't allow anti-Semitism to function within their organizations and within the issues that they pursue. The third, I think, is this. You know, these types of acts of terror, whether they are individual or concerted, a mission-style bias crime of an organization, the goal is to attempt to intimidate the targeted community, right? To drive them into isolation, to make them fearful to participate in democratic life, right? And to try to make them believe that they are isolated and alone. You know, I'm here to say, right, that is not the case. If anything today at a high level strategy, I think it is important for those of us who are not Jewish to make sure that the Jewish community knows that it is not alone, and that those of us who aren't Jewish believe that the way forward is in lockstep with the Jewish community. This was not just an attack on the Jewish community. This was an attack on American democracy. And our commitment is that we will not allow you to be isolated. We will not allow you to be vulnerable in America. We are a better nation than that. And that should be our commitment to the Jewish community and any other community that is vulnerable. We don't have to agree on everything. We can have passionate disagreements. But what we agree on is that everyone here has the right to live, love, and work free from fear and bigotry. And finding those ways to stand together, whether it is rallies, whether it is notes of love and solidarity, whether it is joint op-eds, whether it is, I just got a note today from two women who have never met, but one belongs to a Jewish quilting club and one belongs to just a more local community quilting club, and they are joining forces to create a quilt, to mark this moment and make a commitment to one another. It is those types of things at the end of the day that will help us get both through this moment and to the society we say that we are.
Right. So you may have already hit on this, especially those latter remarks. Are there practical steps, things we can do now that might call attention to it? Creative ideas on how we could make sure that we move the ball forward and make it less likely in the future?
Yeah. So, for organizations, I think organizations should create a statement, and that statement should be both about what happened in Pittsburgh, the context that got us here, and to talk about the need to condemn anti-Semitism. And I think an organization should get that out to their membership, right? Their supporters. It's important to let people know where we stand. So that's one concrete thing an organization can do. The second thing an organization can do is to immediately set up meetings with elected officials. And to just say, we now need you to step up, right? And if you don't step up, we are going to look for ways to hold you accountable, right? And we mean it. And I think it is because, again, it's critically important. The third thing that an organization can do is to reach out to the Jewish community or hold a joint meeting of organizations, right? And pre-plan, because I'd like to say this won't happen again. I'd like to say that this is the worst that we will experience, but I don't know that. And so I feel that we need to have these conversations ahead of time, so that if this ever did happen in our communities or in our states, we know exactly how we will come together. We know who our friends are, and we know how to get in touch with them. I think those are three very specific things that organizations can do right now. As individuals, right, there are also things you can do. There are many vigils and rallies that are taking place around the country. I think it is important to be visible. The second is I tell people, don't wait for leaders and organizations to tell you what to do. This is a moral time, and be creative. Do something, even if it's putting a sign on your lawn or in your window, or writing a note to the local synagogue, or go meet with your elected officials. There are things you can do as an individual, and I know, David, you have talked about a place that you might be able to provide resources for folks to look, but it's important for us to do something. While I'm not Jewish, I have come to learn the term dayenu, right? And we don't have to do the whole of the journey. We just have to take each step as if it is its own complete step. And so I just really encourage people to do one thing. It doesn't have to be a large national march. It can be simply a nice note to your neighbor, letting them know that this is their community too, and that you're there for them.
Great. We really appreciate that. We will be putting up resources and sharing ideas and information. We're going to be monitoring what happens at local levels and sharing best practices. We'll have a resource out on jewishpublicaffairs.org in short order. And we really appreciate, Eric, your advice to us, your guidance, your experience in diagnosing this and giving us some great ideas and thoughts on how to move forward. And I just want to once again express our heartfelt condolences to the Pittsburgh community, and we are there for you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you. Appreciate you.